Hi, and welcome to the second short lecture from Chapter 4 in your textbook. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about influences on perception. One of the most important factors that has the potential to influence how we make sense of other people in particular is access to information. As your book explains, we can only make sense out of what we know. So, as we observe others in different roles, we often gain information that could change how we view them. So, for example, if you found out that the high school bully that picked on you every day of your freshman year came from a family where he was being abused, you might view him differently. Or if you find out that your communication professor spends every Saturday night in the strip club, you'd probably think differently of him, right? So as we gain more information about people, it changes the way that we make sense of them and the messages that they send out. Now, social media oftentimes is a great source of information that can change our view of people. This is why it's important to consider what you post, as we discussed in Chapter 2, why it's important to consider what you post before you post it. Anything you put on social media, you want to reflect who you want to be, right? Because how other people perceive you as they gain information, they change how they view you. Now, there are physiological influences as well. First off, each of us has what your book calls unique perceptual hardware. Now, when we're talking about perceptual hardware, we're talking about our actual senses, right, and our sense organs. So I mean, we all see differently to a certain extent. Some people have more accurate vision than others. Some people are colorblind, for example. Some people have impaired vision. Some people are deaf, right? I went to high school with a girl who had no sense of taste, for example. So again, our hardware, the sensing instruments that we're equipped with vary from person to person. And this will have an influence on how we perceive stimuli. There are also physiological factors that influence perception. Differences in how we see, how we smell, how we taste, how we hear, and how we feel. So again, this is something that I've oftentimes thought of. So my wife, for example, loves pickles. I hate pickles. Now, it could be that when she eats a pickle, it tastes like chocolate to her. I don't know. I can never be her, and I can never experience pickles in the way that she does, right? So there could be very real differences in how we experience things, and we might not even be aware of it. And of course, there are psychological challenges as well. So, as we know, people are wired differently. People have different chemical reactions in their brains to different stimuli. So, as a result, there could be very real sort of physical influences on the way that we make sense of stimuli and how we perceive the world around us. Age, of course, can make a difference. So as you get older, you likely perceive the world around you in a different way. Health can make a big difference. For example, when my mother got older, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This is the disease, it's a neurological disorder where people oftentimes shake and have trouble moving around. Now this bad health that she was in influenced how she thought of different places. So restaurants, for example, she would decide whether or not a restaurant was good or bad, not based on the quality of the food, but on how easy it was to get in and out of the restaurant, how well lit it was, how many steps they had. Things that made a real difference in her ability to negotiate the terrain affected the way she viewed the restaurant, whether or not she thought it was good or bad. Hunger can make a big difference in how we perceive the world around us. We know, for example, that students who are food insecure, students who don't know where their next meal is coming from, and oftentimes are hungry or try and learn while hungry, have a really difficult time learning. This is in part why we started the food bank at Gordon State. And then, of course, there are biological cycles or biological changes within people that influence how we see the world around us. You know perfectly well, for example, at this point in your maturation, that you probably view you probably view people that you're sexually attracted to in a different way at 18 than how you viewed people when you were 5, for example, right? Your body has made significant physiological changes, and so as a result, maybe you look at men and women as sexually attractive when you never did before, right? So again, all these kinds of physiological factors can influence how we perceive the world around us. Cultural differences also influence the way we see the world. Every culture has its own worldview, its own way of looking at things, right? And so as a result, they see the world differently. One of the biggest challenges with this is ethnocentrism, which is the attitude that one's own culture is superior to others. This is the attitude this is a attitude, I should say, that's particularly prevalent in the United States. We see, for example, that oftentimes when they travel, Americans expect everyone in foreign countries to be able to speak English and get frustrated when they don't. This is a very clear example of ethnocentrism. Now, of course, you don't have to travel abroad, or you don't have to go to Europe or Asia to see cultural differences or see differences in cultural perspectives. In fact, you don't really have to go any further than the university or the college, rather, itself. There are people who belong to different groups, different co-cultures, who are part of the larger college system, but probably have very different kinds of beliefs, understandings, and ideologies that affect how they see the world and how they make sense of it. Of course, social roles also play a major factor in perception and how we make sense of things. We know, for example, that from the time we're born, each of us is indirectly taught a whole set of roles that we'll be expected to play. So, as I explained before, these roles are related to both gender, right, and sex. So, sex is biological. Sex is what you have on you, what God gave you. Gender are these social roles that are ascribed to men and women, masculinity, femininity, right? So, what we call gender roles are the socially approved ways that men and women are expected to behave. And when we think of this, there are all kinds of gender rules, or gender roles rather, that are out there that we know exist, but we really don't think a whole lot about. So I ask, for example, many of my classes, does anyone here work in a daycare, for example? Usually when I ask this, a number of young women raise their hands. This is what we call a gendered occupation, where for no good apparent reason, it just seems that women tend to work in daycare or nursery kinds of scenarios more than men do. And again, this is a socially constructed gender role. There are some things that occupations, for example, that women are expected, it's fine for women to do, but not okay for men to do, and vice versa. Now, of course, many of these gender roles today are changing. And this is upsetting to many people. People who've grown up with very strict kind of ideas of gender roles, what men should do and what women should do, are finding themselves confused because, again, many of these roles are changing. And oftentimes, that's threatening for people and something that we all need to recognize. So it's good, I think, oftentimes to change gender roles and have these gender roles be fluid. But we also have to respect the fact that many people have grown up with very firmly established ideas about these roles. And we have to work with these folks to get them to accept the idea that these roles are malleable, that they're changeable. There are also occupational roles that affect our perception. So the kind of work we do can influence our view of the world. So for example, if you're out there, if you're a policeman, for example, and your job is to go out and deal with people who are breaking the law all the time, who are robbing, raping, selling drugs, murdering, right? Chances are you're going to end up with kind of a negative view of humankind after a while. At the same time, if you involve yourself in some sort of activity where you're constantly exposed to the best of people, chances are you're going to be more optimistic in your perceptions of others. Now, of course, even within the same setting, the different roles that people play affect their perception. So, for example, there's a big difference in how I view the course content and the quizzes and the exams and so on in this course than how you view them as a student, right? So even though we might be both part of this same class, we're going to look at these stimuli, at these materials in different ways. Now, relational roles can also affect the way you see the world. So, for example, when I became a parent for the first time, I was suddenly aware of all the dangerous stuff in my house, stuff I had never thought about before. Every time I walked into a room, I saw all the sharp corners that my kid could bang into and hurt themselves. I saw every electrical outlet that didn't have a plug in it. All these things stood out to me suddenly because becoming a parent made me aware of all the dangers that lurk out there for my child. And as a result, I came to see the world in a different way. Something that you might be more familiar with as young people is the idea of love goggles, right? Where when we first meet someone, we're so taken with them, as when we start a relationship as a boyfriend or a girlfriend, we're so taken with people that oftentimes we don't see a bunch of flaws or a lot of the negatives with that person. And it might not be till later that you look back and say, why was I interested in that person? I didn't see all these things that were wrong with them. All right, that's it for today. In the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about common tendencies and perception. Thanks for checking out this lecture.